Ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be the top 10 best pack-a-punched loadout weapons in Cold War Zombies. Whether you're playing the game in its current content or you're waiting on more Year 2 Zombies content to come, either way, this is going to cover both of those bases there. We're going to be going over basically the top 10 meta builds and the best guns that you can bring into game and different ways and varieties you can use them that suit all sorts of play styles. But as Cold War is still adding new weapons, this list is subject to change in the next coming months when Cold War does add more content, so keep that in mind. But in general, here are going to be some of the best top 10 pack-a-punched loadout weapons. Just before we start, if you guys enjoyed the video, all I ask in return is a thumbs up, subscribe if you're brand new, and let's get started. Coming in number 10 is going to be the Tec9 SMG, which I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with how this gun works in Zombies, or for those of you who have never played it or ranked it up, this is probably one of, if not the most attachment-dependent gun, because when you play this from level 1, it's honestly nothing too special. You need to manipulate it quite a lot through attachments to bring it to its highest effectiveness, and so through a lot of testing and trial and error, probably the best setup of attachments I'm going to recommend for the Tec9, I would try to follow build somewhere along the lines of this. The most important attachments are the full auto repeater, and I would even say the laser sight. Now, everything else you can kind of play around with. The magazine's very important too, but there was a change at one point in which 3-round burst did not have its damage nerfed, whereas the full auto did. I believe they reverted this change specifically for zombies, so you can use full auto or you can use 3-round burst and it doesn't matter. The full auto seems to feel a little bit better to me, and I also don't think this weapon really needs any kind of red dots. I think the irons are pretty good, and I just like the way it looks without it, but it's a fantastic gun when ran like this nonetheless. It plays really well with napalm burst for that increased damage, and also cryo freeze as well with that slower fire rate. Next is going to be the Stoner 63 LMG, and of all of these selections we've been made available to throughout Cold War's life cycle, the Stoner 63 is still by far the most well-rounded and generally effective LMG. Now, it's fair to say that LMGs really aren't applicable to every situation in Cold War Zombies. There's a lot of circumstances in which you kind of don't want to run like a big bulky gun, but in the case of like camping strats and those kinds of situations that require very low mobility, I decided to make a build that really plays to this LMG's strengths. Like, obviously mobility and movement are going to be hindered to some extent with this build, but honestly, if you're not moving at all, you have a lot more damage and also recoil control up front, which is very important. So it's worth running like a lighter secondary on the side just in case you do need to move around a little bit, as Cold War is a bit of a more fast-paced game. You kind of need to be on your feet to some extent. It's not impossible to move around with this build, but it definitely is less optimal. And surprisingly, the hipfire is really good for an LMG. That isn't very common among LMGs generally speaking, or even amongst the Cold War ones, besides I guess the Ameli. But other than that, this weapon doesn't have too many weaknesses at all, and I think it's pretty cut and dry as far as like where you can apply this weapon and its effectiveness. Next up, we have the AMP 63s, and I'm just going to give you a spoiler alert really quick. These are going to be the only pistols that appear on this list. I know the Diamatis are also extremely good, and to be fair, they are pretty close in their overall effectiveness, but I like the AMP63s a little bit better just for a couple of reasons. Number one, they feel a lot more consistent. I think due to the nature of the burst fire that the Diamatis primarily have, they feel a little bit like, they just don't feel as precise, and honestly, as well with the AMP63s, if you're not running dual wield, really don't bother, but otherwise, they are absolutely phenomenal when set up correctly. For being just pistols, they're deceptively powerful, and I'm also going to recommend if any of you guys are struggling with the Legion boss fight specifically in Cold War Zombies, run these in the fight and you'll have no problem at all. Interestingly, that fight has a mechanic in which the lower power guns you bring into the fight, the lower or decreased spawns you're going to get. So if you bring a ray gun, you'll have tons of zombies, but if you bring in M63s, which are pistols, the game will let up on you a little bit, but that's no problem because this gun actually shreds not only zombies, but also the boss enemy. Absolutely fantastic weapon, and can't get enough of it, really. Next up, we have the Street Sweeper shotgun, which I thought was going to be the worst shotgun in the game until the Ironhide came out. Spoilers, that's also not going to be on this list, but the Street Sweeper is really interesting. It's got some interesting properties that certainly set it apart. If you're using this unpack-a-punch, by the way, don't bother. It is a literal nightmare. It's also a nightmare using this without speed cola in general, but there's a couple attachments that you can use to make your life a lot easier, and when it is pack-a-punched, and assuming you have the right build, it's honestly not too bad at all. In fact, it's really good. Now, the one attachment that is absolutely required required is the barrel that increases the damage, because I tried this without, and otherwise this feels like an entirely different gun without the damage barrel. I'm not sure what it is, but I think a lot of people usually prefer either the Howler or the Gallow anyways, but in the off chance that the Street Sweeper is a little bit more viable, then this is the build that I would recommend to anyone. And honestly, it is a fun switch up every now and again when you're not tryharding with either of these two weapons, but it's a lot of fun to play. It's certainly unique in its class, but I can't say it's the best shotgun in the game. It is a good time though. After that is going to be the Pharah assault rifle. Now this is definitely one of my favorite assault rifles in the game, and I certainly think it's one of the best, but the problem that I see with it is it can be relatively inconsistent, and it does need attachments in order to make this as viable as it can be. Even with the proper or optimal attachment setup, the recoil can be kind of difficult to control, and you know, those instances in which you need to hit a precise target like a headshot or something on a special enemy, the Pharah can struggle a little bit with that, but otherwise I think is most suited to taking out just hordes of regular zombies. Really good magazine size, napalm burst goes really hard on this gun, like everything's great other than the slightly difficult to control recoil that is not great at hitting precise targets. Other than that, great if you're just jumping into Onslaught or even a round-based map just to shoot zombies and nothing else. I think the Pharah is probably one of the best choices for that, so strongly consider it if you haven't used it already. After that though, we have a pretty similar gun in terms of just the way it plays, but the Groza I think is a little bit better than the Pharah, not only in terms of its DPS. I believe currently in Cold War, this is still retains the highest DPS out of all of the assault rifle class, which is, there's a lot to be said for that, and it's got honestly a better magazine size, all things considered. There's a lot that the Groza does better, and the recoil feels a lot more consistent. Unfortunately, the fire rate is a little bit lower than the Pharah, and there's not really much you can do about that, but this setup I found to be particularly effective for this weapon. I don't think it's quite as reliant on attachments as something like the Pharah is, so that means there's a little more room for experimentation. If there's a particular setup or attachment that you like better, feel free to run it on the Groza. This was just a general blueprint of one that I think really gets the job done. Just after that though, we have the Tec9 SMG, yet another DLC one. There's been very few weapons that are just base guns that came and shipped with the game on this list, but the Tec9 was actually, I guess, one of the first DLC SMGs, and it's probably one of, if not the best as well. Now, it's a little bit different to the Tec9, where this has a significantly higher fire rate, so it's going to straight up be much better for up-close situations. Now, the good news is this weapon comes full auto out of the box already, so you don't need an attachment to make it that function like you do on the Tec9, so you've got a little bit room for other experimentation and for other things. Now, I don't think the iron sights are nearly as clean as the Tec9, but they're doable, they're passable, and I honestly really don't think you need to aim down the sights that much with this weapon anyways. The hip fire is incredible, mobility's great, and you kind of want to be shooting from the hip depending on what you're playing anyhow, but otherwise the Tec9 is just unbelievable damage. It doesn't look like it would be that strong, but it really is. If you're just shooting regular zombies as well and not fighting boss enemies or anything like that, napalm burst is highly recommended on the Tec9 because of its super fast fire rate. You're going to be putting out insane amounts of damage. So getting into our top three, we have the Howler shotgun, which I'm going to say is probably the best specialized shotgun in the game. For if you're playing Outbreak or high rounds on that, hands down, this is a weapon that is a must-have. You literally can't play anything else. However, while the Howler is easily the best specialized shotgun, it's a little more nuanced, where if you're playing Easter eggs or you're speedrunning or something, you're probably going to want something a little bit different, because the Howler unfortunately is a little bit slow firing compared to the other shotguns. It hits like an absolute truck, don't get me wrong, and there is something to be said for being one of the only guns in the game that a max health zombie can still be one-shotted in the head by this particular weapon if you're up close. Now, it does require you to be accurate, and Deadshot really helps this a lot, but also just getting good at firing from the hip and aiming specifically for the head with these zombies is very important as well. Coming in at number 2 is going to be the M16 Tack rifle. Obviously been one of the best guns in the game from the very beginning, and if you've even played Cold War Zombies, you probably know how effective it is. Now, I really expected for this to be overtaken by some kind of DLC weapon throughout the season, and don't get me wrong, we got a lot of really good tack rifles, but nothing that surpassed the M16 in my opinion. There's, just like the shotguns and the Howler, there's a few that are better at a couple specialized situations, but you're not going to find anything that's just as well-rounded for literally literally any game mode, going up against any kind of enemy, even boss fights, this is absolutely stellar at. It can handle every boss fight in Cold War Zombies on its own. In fact, this is the gun that if I'm playing a brand new map, I'm going to take in first and foremost, because I don't know what to expect and I don't know, what sort of situations I'm going to encounter. Also, there's a lot of room for experimentation with this one. You can play something that's a bit more up close and aggressive with a faster fire rate and a, lower magnification scope, or you can play the complete opposite. Not only is it statistically the best tack rifle in the game, but it's also the most palatable for any kind of playstyle. So I think this is going to be really strong, not only in the current meta of the game, but even going into year 2. I do doubt that any new weapon in the tack rifle class is able to surpass the M16. Before we look at our number 1 spot, I want to give a quick honorable mention to the most broken gun in the game. It's not necessarily the best, but with the addition of PhD to Cold War, it absolutely broke this gun, and there's no way around saying that. Now, the cool thing about the Thumper, even if you're not using it with Ring of Fire, it's actually not that impressive damage-wise against maxed health enemies, but the really cool thing is that it knocks them over for a certain period of time, rendering them completely harmless for a couple of seconds. So this is really good when paired with something like a ray gun to actually finish them off, but it's a great panic option, and it's impossible to down yourself with PhD, so it is phenomenal. Finally, coming in at the best gun on this list, the actual best pack-a-punch to loadout weapon to bring in is going to be the Gallow shotgun. Now, again, I do want to say that it's maybe a little bit less specialized than something like the Howler, not quite as good on max, difficulty zombies and in high rounds, but other than that, it handles boss enemies like they're absolutely nothing. The build is going to be pretty similar to the Howler in terms of optimizing attachments, and the good news is this can be applied basically anywhere in the game, meaning you can play an Outbreak, Onslaught, or even just round-based maps, and no matter what you're doing, the Gallow will pretty much never be considered a bad option. Now, there are some cases in which you will need a complementary secondary to run. For example, if you're playing boss fights such as Forsaken, where the enemy is pretty far away, the Gallow isn't really going to reach as far as you need it to, so it's worth pairing with something slightly more long range, or even a wonder weapon in most cases. That's very true in Outbreak, but other than that, the weapon on its own is virtually unbeatable, and it's literally better than any other shotgun in its class. And I think going into Cold War Year 2, I do not believe there's going to be any weapon that overtakes this as just the overall general best gun in the game, hands down. I guess we'll see, though. I could be wrong. We still have some unreleased weapons that are coming to Cold War that could shake up the zombies meta, and hopefully we get to play this weapon on even brand new maps as well. So let me know what you guys think about my list down below. What are some weapons that you would have included on this list? Make sure to let me know down below in the comments. But also, I do stream over on Twitch. If you don't follow me, link to that's in the description. I'd love to see you there. But drop a like, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you guys in the next one.